And this is the new reality tonight. Images from Al Jazeera seen around the world showing Taliban fighters inside the presidential palace, triumphantly declaring the restoration of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan.
Hello, this is Tarek Fatah from Sun Media. I write my columns every Thursday, but what really has got my attention is the trouble in Afghanistan. I lived in Pakistan for first 30 years of my life and was closely associated with some of the folks who were subsequently overthrown in Afghanistan. Many of the presidents were murdered, hanged, despite the fact that there were efforts to bring them together. Afghanistan was a casualty of the Cold War. It was where the Soviet Union and the United States, prior to that, Great Britain wanted to stop Russians from reaching the warm waters of the Arabian Sea. And during the Cold War, the Americans wanted to stop the Soviet Union from reaching to the shores of the Arabian Sea. And therefore, Pakistan was deployed to overthrow the regime of Nur Muhammad Taraki, the revolution that overthrew King Zahir Shah. Subsequently, the push and pull between the superpowers of the Cold War determined the affairs of what happened in Afghanistan. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the new danger that has arisen for the Western world and probably the whole of the Middle East and South Asia is the rise of the same demons that the Americans promoted, which is the soldiers of Islam or Islamism that were inculcated into believing that theirs was the right to rule the world, because otherwise it would be inhabited by the non-believing communists of the Soviet Union, and therefore they had to be destroyed. But it didn't stop there. After the Americans brought in Ziaul Haq as the president of Pakistan, the same fellow who massacred about 20,000 Palestinians in Amman, Jordan in the 70s as a brigadier serving the king of the country at that time, came over and hanged the Pakistani Prime Minister, Mr. Zaide Bhutto, and took over the country and turned all of Pakistan into the bridgehead that it was destined to become of experimenting with Islamic rule, or bringing in the 12th century and adapting it to the 20th or now the 21st century. What has happened now in Afghanistan has been a colossal betrayal by the United States through its agent, I would say Zalmay Khalilzad, who has served 3 American administrations, is an American of Afghan origin, who primarily has played the role of Pakistan, representing Pakistan, not Afghanistan. So the leaders of the Taliban who were in Pakistani prisons were released from prison and sent to Qatar, which is another surprise for me, because Qatar is the closest ally of Iran, but the Americans trusted Qatar. And Doha is where this conference took place, in which the Taliban were offered a safe passage to power by the Americans and the Pakistanis. And that's what happened. As much as the Americans keep saying we put in trillions of dollars, and the army of the Afghans just didn't know how to fight.
American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves.
That's complete nonsense, because most of the money that the Americans spent in Afghanistan went back to the United States, to the armament companies, to the private companies that had contractors on the ground, who simply flew out of the country before anything could happen. It was my sources from within the Kabul presidential palace, and mind you, these were the cleaners in the palace who had contacts here in Hamilton, who said that it was the Americans who cleared out Kabul, took away all the government material, handed it over to the Pakistanis, and then invited the Taliban to come in and take over before the Americans left the presidential palace. Now, these are ground reports. These are sources that I greatly trust, but this has been the misfortune of the Afghans for a very long time. So we now have a situation where the Americans are asking the Taliban to help them get out of the country. It is incredible that there is no voice in the United States or here in Canada that tells Mr. Trudeau, how can this happen? How can we send our troops? Our men die in battle, many are injured, they come back trying to set the people free and have a democratic election, which did take place. And then you facilitate the coming in of the Taliban because you created another shadow boxing competitor called now the ISSK that no one ever heard of, but everybody now is an expert on. Oh, that means Khorasan. No. It's all made in Pakistan, made as Pakistan. And the goal ultimately is the death and destruction of non-believers. Non-believers are who? Primarily the Hindus, Jews, number two, or maybe there's a competition there. Christians, of course, our first page talks about how God has cursed the Christians. And it continues from there. Now the question arises as to what's going to happen. Well, all hope is not lost. You have to understand that according to the Afghan constitution, the vice president takes over as the president if the president has run away. And the vice president has got himself out of Kabul and has joined rebel forces in the Panjshir Valley in the north of Kabul. This is the place where the great fight against the Soviets took place. Ahmad Shah Massoud, if you remember, he was assassinated just 2 days before 9/11 under very shady circumstances. His son is now leading the battle. The vice president is now over there, Amrullah Saleh, and they have a functioning government over there. So Taliban are there in Kabul, but rest assured that they have the support of almost 0% of the population. People are trying to get out any which way they can. Now, the Russians are careful about this, so are the Chinese. Chinese interests are on the mineral wealth, the lithium that is in Afghanistan. So they've tied up with the Pakistanis. But it's only the Russians who now realize that if this is not controlled, this jihadi culture will creep into the republics, the stands of Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan that are below the Russians. So they are taking the most practical steps in making sure that this, I would call it a disease, does not spread beyond the borders of Afghanistan. But as long as Pakistan is there and the Pakistanis are able to fool the United States and even countries like Canada, where you now have a law on Islamophobia that you can't even say what I'm saying right here, this will go from bad to worse. The hidden card in all of this is the Republic of India, which has the most to gain and most to lose if this gets out of hand, because the Taliban will try to infiltrate into Kashmir, which is an Indian state, but partly occupied by Pakistan, but who all the Islamists want to so-called liberate from Hindu occupation. There's a serious problem there because Pakistan is also a nuclear state, and nobody knows who has the control, because nobody knows if the prime minister is on his own or he is resting on the military. So the future days will show us if the Taliban can be controlled. But my prediction is that this is the opening stages of another civil war in Afghanistan, where the 50% of the population that is not Pashtun, but Tajik and Uzbeks and the Shia Muslims and the Hazaras, they will rise up against this horror that has been unleashed, unfortunately, this time by our American friends. Well, that's me for today. And if you have anything to say about or react to what I said, please feel free to post your messages or share it with others, because we at The Sun would like to hear from you, our readers, how they react to a situation so far away, yet so close. Thank you. Take care.